Just want to say hello to everybody before I share my screen, and thank you, Sarah, for inviting me here tonight to share what I've learned over a decade of working in water quality with landowners and on all different types of landscape. I was a soil scientist for many years for the Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs, working on rangeland projects and river restoration projects. And then, so now to today, where I work for ODA, and I work with farmers and ranchers all around the state, working to prevent and control water pollution from ag activities. So, so normally when we have our in-person class, I can talk to you guys and ask you what kind of landscapes you have. So Sarah, can you let me know, like, do you have a lot of farmers here, or we got urban landowners, or a mix? What do you have here?
We have more rural landowners, some farmers, some just rural landowners. We have a number of people that were also affected by the fires recently, that are like learning what to do with their landscape now that they have to kind of start from scratch.
Sure.
And it's a good mix of agriculture, including cropland and pastures, as well as kind of small acreages that people have that are more natural areas. And then there's a couple of folks that are more on the rural or on the urban side of things.
Okay, very good. So we got a little bit of everybody who's has the potential to manage for water and water conservation. That's awesome. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I put this presentation together. And what I'm going to do is just start. First, I'm just going to get you into Water Quality 101. I'm just going to warm up your brains and get you thinking about water and how water moves on your landscape. And I am going to have to, hold on, let me do some, turn my screen off because I've got low bandwidth because I'm broadcasting from home instead of the office. All right, so let me turn this video off. There we go. Okay, that way I won't lose you. All right, so, and then I'm gonna start with some Water Quality 101, and then I'm gonna slip into a little soil health. And you may wonder why I would talk about soil health when I'm talking about water, and so I'll share that with you. And then I'll go into different types of water conservation ways you can work on your land. It's all very broad, and it's all meant to really just inspire you to think about your landscape and how you could manage for water quality. And then I have a slide at the end where we'll talk about water quantity or water conservation. All right, let me get my, okay, there we go. All right, so I'm gonna start out with some fun water facts. I find these very interesting. I think it's very interesting to understand that there's the same amount of water on Earth as there was when the Earth formed. And so, you know, that 100%, that whole part of that water, nearly 97% of it is salty or otherwise undrinkable, and of that 100, all that water, 2% is locked into our ice caps and glaciers. And that leaves just 1% of our total water supply to help us with what humanity's needs for agricultural, residential, manufacturing, community, recreation, and personal needs. So, I mean, it's quite striking to think that we only have access to 1% of the world's water supply. Another cool fact is, you know, our brains are 75% water, and so is a living tree. So when you look at a tree, you don't think water, but it's composed of a lot of water. The average total home water use for each person in the US is about 50 gallons a day. So I don't feel I use that much, but I don't measure it, but I try really hard not to, but that seems like a lot of water. So, okay. So I'm going to talk to you about water. Oh, yes. Sorry, I'm running two screens here. I'm going to talk about water quality management in Oregon. And, you know, back in the day, before the 1972 Clean Water Act, there wasn't any real regulation managing for water quality and what about pollution entering our water. And back in when the Clean Water Act was passed in '72, it was delegated to the states to manage for water quality. And in Oregon, there's three major agencies that manage water quality, and that's Department of Environmental Quality, Oregon Department of Agriculture, and Oregon Department of Forestry. And so we manage at the state level, but we work at local levels to manage for water quality. In Oregon, when we started managing for water quality, we developed beneficial uses. We defined what do Oregonians use water for, and what are we protecting it? Why are we protecting it? And so our beneficial uses in Oregon are, everything from just the beauty of a river or a glacier, boating, fishing, aquatic life, electric power, industrial water supplies, food manufacturing, livestock watering, our water supplies, our drinking water, which is most important to all of us. And then of course for our wildlife and our creatures in our ecosystems. Particularly in water quality and concerns in Marion County, we have concerns with stream temperature. Our streams are too warm in the summer to manage for rearing fish. We have bacteria issues. We also, which is bad for recreation and contact. Sediment, which clogs up our streams and makes our water dirty for aquatic life. Salmon have a trouble navigating in real turbid waters. Nutrients, runoff from fertilizers and bacteria from waste. We also have pesticide issues in our water. We have sampling, monitoring around the state, and in Marion, we're picking up signals from pesticide residues. Metals, they're are natural in our system, but they enter our water from soil erosion. And then toxics, a whole plethora of toxics, from fire retardants to tire and manufacturing chemicals. So, water quality, when I know many years ago, some years ago, I was doing some research and I saw some pictures of the Willamette Valley, actually Pudding River in the 1930s. And, the water was real dirty. It was filled with garbage and there were dead fish everywhere. And, we've come a long way. So I'm not trying to raise a big alarm here, but I just want to make people aware that we have pollutants in our surface waters and in some of our groundwater. And we need to do our share to keep these pollutants from entering the water where we can. Those pollutants come from two major sources. We call them point and non-point sources. A point source would be, something like a manufacturer, an industrial plant that uses manufacturing water and they pipe it out through a pipe. And so we know where that pollutant is coming from. And then there are non-point source pollution sources. And this is where, rain and stormwater picks up pollutants from the ground and carries it both to our streams and in some cases to groundwater. And I'd be amiss if I didn't talk to you about regulations. You're going to be very lucky tonight. You have Michael de Blasi coming in to talk to you from the Department of State Lands. And so they're on regulations related to wetlands and streams. And as a landowner, operator, and resident, there are times when you have to adhere to guidelines and regulations when you're managing your landscape, especially streams and for water quality. The Oregon Water Resources Department, they regulate water storage and water rights. I work for the Oregon Department of Ag, as I said, and we regulate agricultural pollution. So any kind of pollution that is as a result of agricultural activities is regulated. And so, and then we also have the Department of Forestry, and they have the Forest Practices Act, which outlines guidelines and standards and best management practices that you have to follow. And then of course you've got your city and county stormwater systems and regulations in those areas. And if you ever need any information related to ag water quality area rules, you can always welcome to call us over at the department, the water quality department. Okay, so the next part of my what I'm going to talk about is conservation planning for water quality and quantity. And I'm just going to start out to get your mind thinking about the hydrologic cycle. I think it's real important when you're on your landscape, you're at your property and you're standing there. And, it may take a few years to really understand how water moves on your property. So we all know, rain comes in, it hits the ground, and it should infiltrate into the ground. And then through that, it filters out into our streams and lakes and oceans clean, and then it just repeats that system, and we find our water supply, that 100% I was talking to, is it's in one of three forms. You've got air, water is air, you have liquid water, and you have frozen water. So water's moving amongst these three different phases in the hydrologic cycle. And as you know, in winter here, we have big rain, long rain precipitation events. We're gathering snow. We're building our snow caps up in the mountains and storing water for the summer. And so that's how all this works as far as the hydrological cycle. But then we can bring it down to our watershed. And we all live in the Willamette Basin, but then you split that down and there's a multitude of sub-watersheds. But when you're looking at your watershed, at your landscape, you want to know where you're at in the watershed. And there's a big important purpose for watersheds. And they capture that rainwater. It's stored in our vegetation and soil and in our ice caps. And then it's released in the summer through streams and precipitation. And so that's how we get water spread throughout our watershed. And a healthy watershed works like a sponge. It grabs the water, it holds it and releases it. When we've removed ground cover and paved over things, parts of your watershed begins to act like a glass bowl. And so when the rain comes, it hits those impermeable surfaces and just washes off right into the stream and into the ocean, and you don't get the benefit of that use in your watershed. All right. So once that water hits the ground, it's going to do a few things. We have surface water drainage. So, in the woods, in the forested areas, those are our most highly permeable areas. So rainwater infiltrates really well in those systems. And as you move down the watershed, you start getting into ag lands and impervious meadows. And so you start having less water absorbed, and it starts to go subsurface, and then it starts to go to our streams and then flows down to our agricultural, residential, and urban areas. So you see that water hitting that watershed at the top and coming downstream to the bottomlands. And there's another thing to think about too when you're on your property. You may not see water on the surface, but you could have water flowing not too far below your feet. We have a lot of subsurface water drainage depending on where you're at. And so sometimes you want to think about where water's moving, where you may have shallow water tables, or where you're seeing water pond in the winter or a spring after large rain events. You may have shallow water tables in those areas. So that was my 101 on water. So now I'm going to make you think a little bit about soil. And soil health is important for many reasons. And what it basically means is that it's the continued capacity of soil to function as a living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. So you have to think of the world below your feet as alive. And there's 4 basic principles for managing soil health. You want to minimize soil disturbance, maintain a diverse plant mix. You want to keep live green cover as much as you can throughout the year. And you want to keep bare soil covered. And so why am I talking about soil health? Why is it important in water quality management? Because these are key soil properties that function to capture, store, and release water, just like I spoke about in the function of a watershed. And how it captures, stores, and releases water influences how pollutants, such as nutrients, bacteria, and pesticide residues are transported to ground and surface water. And I'll show you some of that coming up. So soil health connecting to water quality, as I just spoke about a minute ago, it helps reduce those pesticides and pollutants getting into water. But having soil covered and good soil health, it increases water infiltration, which extends the amount and duration of plant available water that you would have in your landscape. So that helps carry that water supply deeper into the summer, so you don't have to irrigate as early. So having ground cover helps with that. It also improves drainage. Those roots help suck water down and drive it down into the ground, and it reduces the flooding and ponding on your property. It also, that water, once it infiltrates into the ground, it recharges our groundwater. So by not allowing that water to run off and go off into the storms, it's absorbed into the soil and down into the groundwater, recharging it. There's also benefits to it, such as decreased plant and disease and pest problems. So you don't have to rely on pesticides as much or other IPM methods to manage pests such as weeds or bugs. And it also means less stormwater runoff. Soil health also improves nutrient cycling, which allows for less reliance on fertilizers. So you're putting less nutrient inputs into your landscape, so that means less running off. Okay. So another thing, and this is good, also just creating a resilient landscape by having ground cover. Healthy soils resist soil erosion. You've got that ground cover. Here in this picture on the left is a field that went into the winter season that was just run over by tractors, and there was no bare ground, and all of this soil is running off that hillside as a result of those exposed soils. And it went across the street, and on the right photo, it's entering and going across the landscape to a stream in the background. So by had they had either mulch or grass or plants on there, that would have mitigated this issue highly. So soil loss leads to pollutants entering surface water. Soils carry a lot of things. They have the pesticide residues if you're using them. There's fertilizer residues if you're using added nutrients in our water, which creates issues with algal blooms, and sediment and metal. Like I was talking to you, mercury is a metal that's natural in our environment, but is an issue in our water. And bacteria, again, and bacteria is not just livestock, but it's natural in our system. Wildlife, there's all kinds of sources for bacteria. So having that ground cover really helps mitigate that transfer of that to our waters. This is a great example. This photo is a soil health experiment, but you can see on the left and on the far left, so each one of these trays are different types of ground cover, and they dropped rain on these little containers and then the water ran off how it hit into the jars below. And you can see in both the far left one, the far right one, and the middle one, all three of those with the least amount of ground cover had the most dirtiest runoff, or the most darker runoff. And then where there was cover in the second and fourth container, those water bottles underneath are very clear and clean. So you can see how important ground cover and soil health is important to water quality management. And I like to say these principles apply to just about anything. Not every system will work perfectly under soil health. There's some systems where you have to be careful with slug management and stuff when you leave residues, but these apply to any rules. You could put this on your urban garden if you've got a raised bed. I live in the city and I have a lot of containers, plant containers that I grow things in. I use these principles in my containers. You can apply these to large ag fields and pastures. And if you think of those four bullets that I talked about earlier, those soil health principles, if you're having soil erosion issues on your property, you can look at those 4 bullet points and probably find the problem and the solution. So there's some ways we can control and minimize soil erosion on your land. If you are tilling, you could practice conservation tillage. You can roll and crimp and chop your plant residues into the topsoil. If you plant a diverse mix of species into the areas where you want to cover bare ground. That diversity really improves your infiltration. Utilizing intercropping. So if you have a small garden, you know, maybe you could put grass in between some of your areas, or if you've got a small farm, you know, putting grassed aisles around your areas and in your aisles can really reduce soil erosion. Let's see, winter cover crops. If you've got some farmland and you're working the farm, you don't want to leave that bare in the winter. You know, try to find a cover crop that you can put over there. This picture on the left here that I'm showing is the result of a grass field that butts up right against an urban interface, and it was a grass field, and they cleared it late October, way late in the season, and left it, well, they didn't leave it bare, they seeded it, but the plant, the grass wasn't growing there soon enough, and they had a massive storm event, and it just rained really hard for about 6 hours, and this whole road, the road in the background, and you can see there's a trail that we've cleaned it up here at this grill, but it was all covered in soil. It all ran off the side, and the landowner had to come out and put silt fencing up, and he had to mulch the entire field, and it was a mess. And but he learned his lesson. And so you don't want to go into the winter rains, especially on slope lands with bare ground. So, you know, when I worked in Warm Springs, I worked on forest. I worked a lot in forestry, doing assessments of timber sales and stuff. And one of the big things, you know, that I remember from that work is the erosion from roads and small woodlands and forest roads. And so if you're a small woodland owner, I'm sure you're very familiar with this issue. But woodland roads can contribute to poor water quality. They can contribute a lot of all the things I've already talked about, from bacteria to nutrients, pesticide residues, metals. So there are all kinds of ways to manage for this. And so you might want to look into the Forest Practices Act. They have a whole bunch of best management practices and ways to mitigate soil erosion from roads. But I just wanted to make that aware to any new woodland owners or small woodland where you have roads on slopes that might be bare, taking water from the forest into streams or storm drains. Water quality when it comes to livestock and grazing, you know, it all comes down to just managing your pastures in a manner that you don't lose your cover. You want to maintain good pasture forage year round the best you can, and that is from managing your livestock grazing, you know, having them move around from pastures, and keeping an eye on how low you allow them to graze down to. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. And the district and other partners have lots of ways to help you with ways to manage that. I did provide a water quality landowner guide to managing water quality. There's a lot of mention of practices in there. And so there's all kinds of help on how you can manage pastures. Same with horses, you know, horse borders, how you manage your pastures and how you feed them. You know, on the left, that's way overgrazed. That's, you know, that ground is, there's a saying in the soil science world that bare ground is dead ground, and dead ground will result in surface water runoff. So something to think about. Hold on, let me take a drink of water. And if I'm going too fast, somebody alert me to any questions in the chat box. So, you know, here's some ways. These are pictures from places where they manage. On the left, you've got a pasture, divided pastures for rotation. You have graveled, heavy use areas, and animal walkways and fencing to help manage that grazing. Those are ways you can prevent runoff. There's also irrigation, and, you know, in all areas. On the left, we've all seen the irrigation running off the grass into the cement covered parkway or driveway. You know, we don't want to do that. Or running off your landscape or your home or your field into ditches and streams, because all ditches end up in water somewhere, and so into waters of the state. And we want to work to prevent dirty water leaving your property. How can you manage better for irrigation? Well, there's irrigation timing, being very careful and knowing how much water your plants need, from a garden to a big cornfield, understanding what that crop needs to grow, and how do you give and how you would water it. Even in a garden, you can put in drip irrigation, which delivers the water straight to the plant, highly reduces soil runoff, about 80%, by installing micro drip or drip sprayers or timing. A lot of people put too much water into the ground when they're watering, so they're also wasting water. And irrigation can have and does carry those pesticides, fertilizer, and metals when it runs off into our storm drains and streams. Manure management, this is something we get calls on a lot. We have to go to people's property and talk to them about manure management. And we don't always think about it. And I've heard that from landowners. They just really didn't plan for it. So, your animals are going to generate manure, and you need to be able to store it until you can either dispose of it properly, or, hopefully you're sharing that and giving it to people that may need it, or you're using it on your own landscape as a nutrient input. But ways you want to manage your manure is really to keep it covered. You can put a structure up there like this if you've got a lot of manure. And this one here in the right picture, that's a 3-bin composting. You can compost your manure in that way and use it on the landscape. And what's also important, as you see below, is these cement pads, impermeable. You want to protect your groundwater. So there's all kinds of ways you can do this. Talking to a district or watershed council, they can help lead you to these kind of solutions depending on what your operation is and what your objectives are. And there's a good, I have this resource here where you can calculate your manure, how much nutrients and what kind of stuff's in it and how much you would apply per acre. So there's ways to figure out how to agronomically is the word they use, apply manure to your fields or your gardens or wherever. Streamside areas. This is really an important topic because streamside areas, when they're functioning properly, filter out pollutants. So before that runoff gets to a stream, streamside vegetation can get that water clean before it hits the water. It also stabilizes your stream bank, keeps it in place, holds it in place, and prevents soil and erosion and slumping. It also manages for stream temperature. Stream temperature is really important in Willamette, in Oregon, for our salmonid species and aquatic life. And stream temperature is a big problem. And streamside vegetation helps shade the stream and prevent it from heating up when the sun's directly, above it. I talked earlier about rules and regulations, and so Mike DeBlasi from Department of State Lands, he'll get into this, but these are actual situations where I've been on site. And on the left here we have a hazelnut orchard that went just initially started and went into the winter with all that bare ground, and soil was eroding into the stream that's in the background. Down here in the middle left is a stream where they were trying to clean the sediment out. And in doing so, they removed all the vegetation. And so you have to get permission and permits to do this before you do it. Same with on the right, somebody was clearing vegetation right off the stream to extend their cropland. And so, you can't crop right up to the edge. You have to leave an area, and you have to allow for the ongoing growth and establishment of streamside vegetation. And I put this here because this is an example of a compliance case, and this is an extreme one. But this is actually a property on the coast. But this on the left, that is a picture of a property where there had been unmanaged grazing for many decades. So this is legacy impacts that a new landowner was responsible for after they bought it, because they were grazing. And when this came to our attention, they can't graze. You can't have no vegetation on your stream. You have to, they had to plant and revegetate. And these folks were able to get funding because their house on the left photo is just a few feet to the right. So this stream is eating toward their house. And it actually used to be on the opposite side. It jumped its bank. And so they got into a big stream restoration project, and it costs a lot of money to fix that. So if you've got great vegetation along your streams, you need to protect that, because you don't want to have to come back in and do all this work and spend all this money to correct that. Pesticides and water quality. Yeah, we have the pesticide stewardship partnership at ODA. It's a few agencies that come together, and we have gone around the state doing monitoring for pesticides. There has been pesticide monitoring in the Molalla, in Marion County, and in those areas, pesticide residues were being found in the stream. And we just want to pay attention to that. So you read the label, you make sure you're using the right pesticide for the right plant or the right pest. Don't use on windy days. Look at the descriptions and wind descriptions on the label. You don't want drift. You don't want it going into your neighbors or drifting into the water, and you don't want to overuse. And it's best to use integrated pest management, where you use multiple hammers to deal with the situation and not rely completely on pesticides. So maybe you go in and you remove the blackberry by hand. You come in and you might spray the stumps with a pesticide, and then you come back when it's ready and you plant with native trees and shrubs. So those are the things you want to pay attention to pesticides, especially with runoff. If you're irrigating, you don't want that water. You want to use minimal pesticides and minimal fertilizers. I think we all know that. And my last slide is on water conservation and why it's important to conserve water. And like I said earlier when I started, 1% of our water supply, and we're lucky in Oregon, we have a awesome water supply. We got good, clean water for the most part, and we have it, and we have a good supply of it. But it's not always guaranteed, and we're having changes in our climate, and we're going to see water leave our systems and our watersheds earlier than we have in the past. So you'll have to start irrigating sooner. So going back to those principles of keeping your ground covered and managing for water quality also manages for water conservation. And you're doing double duty when you manage for those factors on your landscape. So I think that's all I have, and I'd love to answer questions. I know I went real fast. I'm sorry, I'm a fast talker. All right, let me get this back here. If you want to unshare, I can open up, and then I can use the camera here. Where'd it go? Okay, there I am. And don't be shy. I know it's hard. This is video conferencing is hard to communicate a little bit. So there's no bad question.
If you click onto the grid scene, you can kind of see everybody, which can help a little bit with the question and answer section. So yeah, if folks have questions for Brenda, let's hear them.
No way. We got to have questions. How much time do I have?
So here's one in our chat. It says, if all our vegetation and trees are dead from the wildfire along our stream, can we cut them all down?
Well, that's a good question. I wouldn't cut anything down, and I would seed grass, some type of grass to stabilize your soil, to get that first layer in, and then think about some snags I know are good to keep. Some burnt trees are good to keep, but if I would just remove trees that are hazardous. I mean, that would be what I would do if I was looking at it. A lot of stuff's going to come back in on its own, And so I think your initial worries and concerns would be that surface layer of soil on sloped lands leaving your property. I used to be on the burned area emergency response team. And so I used to have to go in after wildfire and assess the concerns related to water quality. And that was always our first mitigation approach, was to stabilize that topsoil. And then you think about where you would restore plants, trees and shrubs, after you get that. Because burn is good in some places. It helps restore, and you'll get a lot of recruitment on your own. And so, working with a forester or a soil and water conservation district or watershed council to get you those technical resources will get you, because every site's different. Every situation is different. But soil erosion would be your concern.
Hey, Brenda,
Jenny.
this is Jenny. Yeah, I have something to add to that. Laura, if you have acreage, you still need to follow the Forest Practices Act and rules. So you should really check with the Oregon Department of Forestry, Forester for all those rules. There's just a lot for stream areas and removing trees. I've been trying to keep up with it. I don't know if Rebecca's still on, if she can add some information, but I think by default, it's probably just best to call your local ODF forester. And if you don't know that, or have that contact, just get in touch with one of us and we will send that to you.
Yeah, that's perfect answer, Jenny.
Yeah. And good. She said she did put down some grass seed and legumes. So perfect. At least getting something stabilized on the ground and getting something else to grow. That's the first step for sure.
Yeah. And I think that makes you feel like you can do something and contribute now while you look at the long-term picture with your forester.
Awesome. All right, from Ben, we have another question. Other than muddy runoff, what should we be looking for and testing for in runoff? Where would we get testing done if any is needed?
Okay, well, testing is expensive. So you'd have to ask yourself why you're testing that water. So if you have runoff and it's going into a pond and you're wanting to see and you're going to reapply it to your nursery or garden area or farm, you might want to know a little bit about what's going into the water to help see if you're getting pesticide residues or other things. I can see that being a reason to test your water. And there are labs, and I will, maybe Sarah, do you know about the OSU publication on the labs?
I have soil testing ones, but I'm not sure if I have water testing one.
Yeah, there's a OSU lab booklet that has all the labs in Oregon, and I have it. I can mail it to you, and you can get it out to your class here. But it has a list of all the labs in Oregon, and then it has like a little grid, and it puts a little dot for the different things you can test for. And there's, you can test for soil or metals or whatever, and they do water too. But if I would start sampling of anything with my soil and understanding what my soil is and what's in it, how much nitrates, what's in there, your basics. And, as long as you're doing things to prevent that water from leaving your property and entering any surface waters or groundwaters, you're taking care of the problem. And you shouldn't have to spend money on water sampling. But water quality monitoring is done around the state. There's a website, Department of Environmental Quality has a mapper. If you just Google DEQ water assessment, you'll get a map, and you can look at your watershed and look if there's water quality monitoring in your watershed and get that information right there at your hands. So you can click on the water body and the monitoring point and see what the water quality is. It's not available everywhere, but there are monitoring locations in Marion County.
All right. So Lisa says the burn was severe in their area, and they're planning on chipping branches since this is what they have on site to amend their soils. We have straw on our bank, but still seeing some washout areas. Do you have any suggestions for them?
Well, it depends on how serious the washouts are. I mean, if it's still contributing big time, I would recommend some jute, like what do we call it? The black blankets. They're like jute blankets, and it's just a fabric that you can nail down with stakes on your stream bank to help hold it back a little more. And then you might throw some chips on that, added chips. You can do stuff as long as you're not in danger or in steep areas. That can help. You could do silt coir logs along some areas to help, and seed and plant around it. Put little trees and stuff for now. But, you know, some sediment's okay in water, you know, there's some of it's all right. But if you're feeling really concerned about big soil losses, you might want to look into that, those kind of resources. And I don't know if the district has resources to help with some of that smaller erosion type along streams. Do you have some of that information, Sarah?
We do. So we just finished a round of LAPs, which is our program that provides grants to landowners to install conservation practices on their property. It may be worth, since that's more of a timely situation that is needed sooner than later, it may be worth contacting us and talking to us about potentially putting in something earlier than our next round, and just seeing if the board would be able to approve that. If it's kind of an emergency situation. So they are taking into consideration the fires and kind of the emergency situation. Jenny Mizell would know a little bit more about that than I do.
Hey Sarah,
Yeah.
this is Rebecca. And Lisa can contact me. We have some free jute netting, straw wattles, and straw that EPA donated for after the FEMA efforts. I've seen her site, and up there, it has kind of a thin soil layer over the basalt bedrock type rock. So it's a little harder to, get set because of the rock undercroppings. But yes, we do have some jute netting available for free, so she could reach out to us.
There you go. That really helps in those small sites that are, actively eroding. And you can Rebecca, do you have the kind that you can seed, like pack with seeds? Are they?
No, this is just the netting, and then the spikes to stake it into the ground. So
you could potentially put a layer of seed and then the jute.
Correct. And then some straw over it or something along that. Yeah.
Great. Jenny, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that, or are we good?
Nope, we're good. Thank you.
All right, so moving on the chat, James talks about living in a brushy area in Southern California, and after a neighborhood fire, a stand of ponderosa pines burned, leaving sticks standing, and 3 years later, they started sprouting new branches, and 5 years after that, they were healthy. So one thing about, especially this time of year, about your streamside vegetation is that it might still be alive. It depends on the severity of the burn. And so you would want to wait and give it a chance to resprout if it's going to, would be my suggestion. Brenda, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's fascinating because having worked on both the east and the west side of the Cascades, on the east side, it takes forever to grow a tree. But on this side, things grow really fast and real dense. And so you can have some faith that Mother Nature is going to restore a lot of that plant life to your areas. And so that's why talking with a forester and getting a little assistance on how to manage for that and to plug the holes where you might not have that regrowth, and then the soil cover.
Great. All right. And Monica asks about the difference between pesticide and herbicide, and if you are using those interchangeably.
Sure. Well, pesticide is the umbrella. That's the umbrella term. So all sides, there's fungicide, herbicides, bugicides, I don't know. There's a whole bunch. They fall under the umbrella of pesticide. So when somebody says pesticide, they mean herbicide and all those ones I just mentioned. Herbicides are, of course, formulated to, control plants. And insecticides are there to control bugs, and fungicides and algicides, of course, corresponding. So there's a whole village of herbicides under pesticides. So, and what was the second part of that question? Was
So herbicides are just one of the varieties of
Yeah,
pesticide,
yeah.
basically.
yeah, and like it's formulated to control plants.
All right, and Helen asks about small stream or creeks banks that are covered by invasive plants such as reed canary grass and Himalayan blackberry. Do you have suggestions on appropriate removal strategies? You talked about not allowing herbicide into the water, so.
Right. So Jenny's probably got, both of you guys could probably answer that more directly. Yeah, so we want those, let me tell you, the blackberry on our streams is a problem. You know, in the short term, yeah, it's holding your bank together, but in the long term, water is slowly eroding underneath those blackberry shrubs. They're shallow rooted. So over time, in high energy storm runoffs, you know, erosion is going to happen under those blackberries, and then eventually it'll slump. Those blackberries will go into the stream and you'll lose stream bank, and then you'll get a whole fresh brand of blackberries coming back in. The goal for me on Oregon streams is to get them planted with native trees and shrubs, because they do the work and they do it for the long term, and they do it in perpetuity if you allow them to grow. And, you know, once they're just covering the stream, you don't have to worry about it anymore. You just have to do some light, you know, weed management along the stream edges, you know, the vegetation edges. But there's a process, and it doesn't work everywhere. And maybe Jenny wants to jump in on that a little more.
Yeah, I could add a little info on that. I mean, generally, depending on what type of control you want to use, if you want to use herbicides or not, there's kind of different methods and ways of going about that. If you didn't want to use herbicides, mowing at the right time of year, a couple times a year is a good way to get rid of them. But if it's on a creek bank, that might be hard to do depending on how steep it is. So maybe some hand removal or something like that. And then if you wanted to use herbicides, there are herbicides that are safe to use around water. So you could use like a combination of mowing and herbicide. So we like to recommend that you would mow down or cut down the vegetation first, and then use the herbicide after that. So you are using less herbicide and not spraying on, 10-foot tall blackberries. You're spraying just something that's close to the ground. And obviously not spraying like when it's raining or when there's high water or something like that. So being responsible with it. And I'll talk a little bit in my presentation that's coming up next about a fantastic weed control calendar that shows timing and different methods of best practices for controlling lots of different invasive plants. So I think you'll find that pretty helpful, and it's in your resource package that Sarah sent to you.
And timing is important, because you don't want to go into a winter season having just cleared a stream bank.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And I was just going to say, like, once you've removed the weeds, you need to put something else in there to prevent further erosion. So make sure that you're planning ahead of time before you remove the weeds and know what you're going to follow up with, whether it's planting native plants or spreading seed or something of that sort to stabilize the soil.
Right. Or putting down straw or something, or some jute fabric, like we talked about, just to keep that bank stable until you can do planting.
Right. All right, and Wyatt asks for suggestions of where to get native plants for the stream bank versus the blackberries.
That's a Jenny question.
Yeah, I'll talk about that a little bit too in my presentation. And there's also a native plant nursery list, I believe, I'm pretty sure is also in your resources, the electronic resources that Sarah gave to you.